My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. You can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. Find out more about me at johnlobell.com. This is a lecture for my course in Frank Lloyd Wright in the spring of 2014 at Pratt, and it covers Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin East, his California houses, and the Imperial Hotel in Japan. What I'm going to do today is we're just going to look at a lot of projects, and then at some point in the future we'll slow down again and talk more about what they mean. So Frank Lloyd Wright took up with a client's wife, Mrs. Cheney, and that was a scandal, so they went off to Europe. And they came back and lived on, he built a compound on family land in Spring Green, Wisconsin. One of his aunts had a school there, and Wright had designed that school. We see these very strong defining structure at the corners, and it's interestingly reminiscent of what 50 years later Louis Kahn's going to do with pulling out these very strong defining corners. Hello. So when he comes back, he convinces his mother to let him use the land, and he builds this compound. And what we're seeing here is actually one of several versions. It had two fires, one in which Wright was working in Chicago on Midway Gardens, project there, and his servant went berserk, set it on fire, and murdered Mrs. Cheney and her children. Beautiful, lush Wisconsin setting. You come off the road, water here, and you come up, this is a hill coming up and then into the center of the compound. Then over here is the school, and over here is the windmill that I showed you earlier, and we're going to see again. So coming up here, you're coming in here, garages and barns, and later Wright has his apprenticeship there, so people want to study with him are there, and they work on the farms and gardens and workshops and on his projects, and also build the buildings. So we come up from the water, up around, in like that. Lots of water, lots of beautiful, lush land, incredibly beautiful. The only problem is 6 feet of snow in the winter. So we're going to see in a few weeks Taliesin West that he builds in the 1930s in Arizona to get away during the winter. So we come up around in here. This is garage, tractors and stuff. See here, Wright likes to open up the corners. And then there's sort of a lush garden area in the center of the compound. This includes residence space for himself and his wife, architectural offices, and then off here, residences for the apprentices. Interior, and then this rolling, lush landscape. This is a chapel by Silsby, the first architect Wright worked for before eventually ended up with Louis Sullivan in Chicago, and this is his grave. So, after he came back from Europe with Mrs. Cheney, one of the projects he got is Midway Gardens in Chicago. So Midway Gardens was a beer garden, very large German and other Central European populations, and what you do on the weekend is you go to a beer garden. It's like an outdoor bar where you hang out and meet people and socialize. And interestingly, here we are, 1913, 14, extremely abstract geometric plays here. 10 years before De Stijl doing all this kind of rectilinear stuff. In fact, this is where De Stijl gets it from. So it's a huge complex with this open area. You have dancing in there and bands and stuff like that. It was destroyed because when Prohibition came, couldn't serve beer anymore, it went out of business. So there are no color pictures. This is a tinted color postcard, but there's some really interesting design stuff there. it would have been nice to see in color. These are some of his renderings at the time. You see this brick with the horizontality emphasized by scooping out the mortar on the horizontal line like he did in the Roby house. And then look at these chairs. Super lightweight, just made out of wires, years before anyone else was doing this. And then there's a European abstract artist named Bauer. Guggenheim has a big collection of his work. And here Wright's doing it 20 years before. So we don't have this in color, but this very abstract designs. We're going to see this in Kandinsky as well, 20 years later. Okay, around this time, he also gets commissioned for the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, Japan. So this is the original hotel by Wright. This is the 1950s, okay, built in 1915. By the 1950s, this is totally inadequate. So this remains the lobby, and then this is the 1950s modern hotel, and then the whole thing is torn down because our standards for hotels are much grander than they were then. So we're interested to observe that for all of his attack on the Beaux-Arts and symmetry, we have the asymmetrical style houses. When he gets a big, complicated project, he's using formal symmetry. So, reflecting pool here, we drive in, get dropped off, the lobbies, and then these are our rooms. Double-loaded corridor, rooms on either side in the original. And then it gets greatly expanded. So here's a model, and we see this formality, main lobby, dining area in the plan here. And we see the corridor and the rooms. Very weird materials. It's done in brick and then decorative stone cut from lava. So it's very porous and holds dirt. And it's in a style that's weird. It's not Beaux-Arts, it's not Japanese, and Wright doesn't really use it again. Now, when it was torn down, part of it was reconstructed in a park. So we can see a bit of what it would have looked like. Sometimes this is compared to Mayan or Aztec ornament. It's really not classifiable. And this is what the lobby would have looked like. This is an original photograph of the lobby. Now, just after it was finished, Tokyo suffered its worst earthquake of the 20th century. And when you have an earthquake, you get fire, because it breaks gas mains, it knocks everybody's coal stove over, etc. So a big earthquake is going to mean fire. 1906, it happened in San Francisco, burned down most of the city. So it was a devastating earthquake. Wright's building suffered no damage at all. And it became the headquarters for battling the fires, nursing stations, etc. What he had done was, we'll talk about this more when we get to his Usonian houses, but he doesn't like to be rooted into the ground. He sort of likes to float on the ground. So here, of course, he's going to need footings, and So he has these pilings, concrete, and then the wall comes up. Here's our interior corridor. So here's our 2 rooms, our interior corridor. Pilings coming down. The friction pilings going into a certain layer of the soil. Who can tell me what is a friction piling and why we don't use it in New York? We don't use it in New York because we don't have to, because we have bedrock.
Okay.
So you drive the piling down till you hit the bedrock, and it's never going to go anywhere. It's solid down to the core. But when you don't have that, what's a friction piling? So you have a pile driver, boom, boom. Each time you hit it, it goes down a certain amount. When it goes down a little amount, predetermined, that means there's enough friction now, and you don't hit it anymore. So he's got friction pilings here working in this layer of the ground. So he's in this layer. The earthquake is moving around. He's floating on it. So instead of his building, if his pilings had gone down to the seismically active layer, it would have sheared his building. But he was in the surface floating above that. So it did a lot to reestablish his reputation. He's had these ups and downs over decades of his career. This is chinaware from the hotel. I have a set in my office. I'll bring it down when we talk about Wright's ornament. You can still buy this. See this red area here? You have it on the cup. Why would you put your red right here on the cup? To disguise women's lipstick stains. So when you drink tea from a cup, you now have this lipstick stain on it. So that hides it. Okay, now he spent a lot of time in California while doing the Imperial Hotel, because that's how you got there. You take a train from the Midwest to California, and then you get a boat to Japan. He did a series of houses in California called now if we want to be quick and inaccurate, they're called the concrete block houses. But we should actually say concrete tile houses. The first of them is the Millard House, and he calls it La Miniatura. It's in Pasadena. And the site is coming down like this. It's a pond here. So you enter on this level into the garage. Over here, you come in on the upper level, which also has the bedrooms, and then you're in a balcony looking down into the double height living room, and you come down into the ground floor of the living room. So the street is here, and we're coming into the garage. Here we are down at the pond looking back at the double height living room. Here's the living room. And these are the concrete tiles we're talking about. So let's just jump ahead. What is he doing here? What he does is he casts these tiles in concrete in wooden forms on the site. They're about 3 inches thick and about 18 inches on the side. There's a half round scooped out along each edge. When you put two next to each other, that half round becomes a round circle. In that round circle, he drops a 1/4 inch rebar and stuffs grout in there. So now the whole thing locks up to be a two-way steel reinforced concrete slab. And so he can make walls out of it, but he can also make ceilings out of it, because it's a rather strong slab. You then do that twice, with an airspace in between, because a masonry wall is supposed to be double wall with airspace in between. Today we use airspace or insulation, but you need that airspace to handle condensation, let water out, work as an insulation, etc. You can't just make a solid masonry wall. So here's a view from the balcony into the living room. These are some of the concrete tiles, some of the plain, some have these patterns, some this is just an indented pattern, some it's holes. And the holes are used to give us these sunscreens. Okay, so we're in Pasadena, which is very intense desert. They then do a lot of irrigation, so it's lush. Now it hasn't rained in a year, so they're getting worried. But we have very intense sun, so we want to break that up. And then these are just plain. So he's doing these somewhat around the same time that Le Corbusier is doing his concrete architecture. This is Citroen House. What is Citroen? What is a Citroen? It's a French automobile. So when Corbu called this a Citroen House, it would be like an American architect calling it the Model T Ford House. In other words, it's supposed to be mass-produced. The architects are being inspired at this time by Henry Ford, who introduces the Model T at $800. 4 years later, it's $400. And we're still building the way the Egyptians did. We got to get up to speed on this stuff. And so the architects are aspiring to adopt industrial processes to architecture to make affordable housing. So that's what Corbu's doing. Anybody know why this wall is fairly blank? It's a prototype for what would be stacked next to each other and vertically. So this would be, put the next one on top, this balcony is your garden in the sky as you stack these up. But whereas Wright is showing us his concrete tiles and how he does it, Corbu, this is not concrete, this is construction tile. This is tile, red clay to terracotta tile, like when you see those red terracotta sewer pipes. So they're very tough. They're really durable, very strong. And for some reason, we use concrete blocks, the Europeans use terracotta tile. It's just for some reason that's what's economical for them. But then what Corbu does is he smears stucco over it so he can pretend it's poured-in-place concrete. So I like to pick on Corbu when I'm comparing him to Frank Lloyd Wright. So Wright does a bunch of these. This is the Storehouse in LA. Some years ago I was out there driving around. I don't know how people managed before GPS. But anyway, we had a map and a list of all these houses and their addresses. And we visited all of them. And we get to the Storehouse and it has right here a for sale sign. But you had to be very rich to buy it because the people who bought it, did a beautiful restoration. Needed a huge amount of restoration. So when the restoration was done, it was written up in all the architecture magazines. Here you see more decorative patterns with the tiles. And Wright's approach very, integrated with the vegetation. And then he doesn't like a window as a hole cut in a wall, but rather pier window, or say pier glass, the whole glass opening up. This is his rendering. Whoops, gotta go the other way. Now this is a quite prominent house, the Ennis House. How many people have seen the movie Blade Runner? So, you know, if you say, what are the 10 movies you have to have seen? Blade Runner is one of them. The detective's kitchen is shot in this house, and Harrison Ford's kitchen. So we've got, I'm hitting all the houses, and we get to this one, and the whole street is filled with cars you can't park. So we go all the way up here. Turns out we got here just when they're having an open house. So we got the tour. And then the hill's coming down like this, and you're looking out over the city. The owner drives in here, has a patio, parking is here, parking is here, and this is the guest house. Swimming pool here, sort of a lap pool. Now, the owner at the time I was there, I don't know what the latest is, but he couldn't handle it financially. So he gave it to a conservancy so that it's a museum. That meant it's now, he didn't have to pay taxes because it's a nonprofit. And then he had a deal, he could live in it as long as he lived. So that's the way he could help his financial situation a bit. So this is the road. This is where you come in. You come in under here. Pool is right there. And here's the view out over the city. There's downtown LA. Now, poured in place concrete can be not good. That's what sidewalks are made out of. And about every 10 years, they come with air hammers and chop up the sidewalk and redo it, particularly around here because we have freezing. So water gets in, soaks in, freezes, expands, and starts to crack and deteriorate the concrete. Even without freezing, these were very poorly made. Workmen just mixed the cement in a wheelbarrow on the site and dumped it into the wooden forms. Wright knew that, and he imagined these as prototypes for a huge development he wanted to do, at which point these things would be cast in a factory. So when you have precast concrete cast in a factory rather than poured in place, cast on the site, it can be very high quality. It gets to be as good as stone because they use a minimum amount of water, might even use steam instead of water, because all that water in the concrete, after the concrete is chemically used it and set, the water evaporates. Wherever it evaporates from, it's porous. But you have a minimum amount of water, you put it on vibrating beds to really compact it, you can get very high quality in precast. Well, this isn't precast. So these things are deteriorating, and what they did was they painted them with an epoxy paint. Now that's really, you gotta be unhappy about having to do that. On the other hand, you gotta get it done before the thing crumbles. You know, interesting, if anybody finds out the story on TWA, bring it into class, but actually I saw it being poured, I'll tell you how old I am. But the TWA terminal at Kennedy, as close as I can get to it, like when you go on JetBlue, you're on a balcony, you can look right down on it. It looks absolutely pristine, it looks perfect. no dirt, no cracks, no deterioration. Now, they put silicon in it, and the silicon was not a coating, but the silicon caused the water to bead off. And, you know, like if certain types of rain gear, the water will just bead and not soak in. And it doesn't, I'm not mean it's, you know, like linoleum. But there's certainly, you know, it feels like regular cloth, but the water just beads off. So apparently that's what's going on with TWA. You know, it's, they may be having problems, but I haven't heard about it, and it's, you know, 50 years now, so. Almost 50 years. Anyway, inside, of course, it's fine, no weather. Really interesting stuff. So here is some, you know, rough stuff. You see how the concrete is, I don't know if this is chipping. Yeah, here's some chipping. And here's some stuff they've painted. You don't want to, you know, the preservation people are really probably upset about that, but my guess is that they had no other choice. Then you come along 20 years later and you have a much better technology, and you say, how do we get that goddamn epoxy paint off that thing? Like, for example, our arches upstairs outside the cafeteria, the beautiful brick arches, somebody painted them white 40 years ago. So we, you know, the paint was taken off, fortunately, but it probably wasn't good for the brick. Chemicals they had to use to get the paint off. This one's in Oklahoma, Richard Lloyd Jones, one of Wright's relatives. And one of the things interesting here is it's just sort of a bump that sticks out. Here we go. And as we're looking at that, okay, so this roof cantilevers out, and then, of course, butt glass corners, no mullion in the corner, that opens it up, one of Wright's tricks. But what's holding up this piece of glass? As near as I can tell, it's this piece of glass. The glass is self-supporting here. So this is pretty daring stuff. I mean, it's not big scale, so. And then this is a complex San Marco in the desert that was going to be built with these concrete blocks, a huge sort of condo complex, and then the stock market crash in 1929, so it never happened. Now, there's a hotel called the Arizona Biltmore, and one of his colleagues got the job for this, and Wright agreed to consult. So it wasn't his job, but it's very Frank Lloyd Wright-ish. Here we go, Arizona Biltmore. So inside it looks very, it's all, again, these concrete tiles, giving us spectacular interiors. So it's very Frank Lloyd Wright-y. He had a hand in it, but it's not his job. Okay, one more and then we'll take a break. This is the Hollyhock House for Mrs. Barnsdall in LA. It's in a big park. And Mrs. Barnsdall was a rich heiress and wanted to make a huge art center. And she apparently didn't have a long attention span. because Wright does this house for her, and there's supposed to be theaters and museums, this whole center, and then she's off to something else. So it never went further. And this is a stage in Wright's career that's called his Mayan Stage. Now, there's sort of, if you look at Mayan architecture, you look at this stuff, you can say, well, maybe there's some aesthetic influence. I don't think that's really very significant, but that's what it's called. Now, if we look here, these ornaments are like hollyhock trees. And he uses them widely as an ornamental device, and so it's called the Hollyhock House, and also called after Mrs. Barnstone. Spectacular living room, huge complex. Spreads out into the landscape. Now, interestingly, Louis Kahn has had a extremely rigid honesty. You show what it is and how it works. And so Kahn liked to say, the building is the story of the making of the building. So if you look at the medical towers and you see the whole precast system, he then makes the entrance by scooping out one of the pavilions. So you walk in there, you look up, you're seeing the ceiling of every room in there, and it's telling you the story of how it's made. The whole story is right there. You look at Yale, you look at the Yale British Studies. How it's made is all apparent. Wright, I'll use what word, fudges it a lot. First of all, he's famous for using what's called fitch plates. Fitch plate is a flat sheet of metal, say 1/4 inch thick, 8 inches, 10 feet. You take 2x8s. 2x8s won't quite cover 8 inches, but anyway, you take two 2x8s and bolt them to either side of this fitch plate, and now it's really strong. So it's much cheaper than having an I-beam. And then he uses that for big cantilevers in his houses. So he's hiding, there's actually I-beams in the Roby house, and he's hiding them. He doesn't want to tell us there's I-beams in there. And so Wright is not about revealing how it's made. Maybe a little bit, but it's not a fetish with him the way it is with Kahn. And with Kahn, revealing how it's made is the fundamental way in which the architecture communicates itself. Long introduction to, this is concrete block with stucco over it. This is stud wall construction with stucco over it. I don't see a difference. He's not telling me which is which, because it's just a visual effect. He doesn't, he's not overly concerned with that. In the concrete block houses he was, but here he's just communicating these forms. His stained glass is now very abstract. Now, if you're ever visiting one of these things, don't make the mistake I did. Looking at my guide and it says, open on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and I'm there on Tuesday. Okay, so I look at the outside. So later I'm telling this to someone, says, no, you just knock on the door, the security guy will let you in. Oh, I didn't know that. So always try. Don't make a pest out of yourself. Don't go knock on people's private home doors, but you never know. So, water in front of the fireplace is somehow symbolic, fire and water. Okay,